Welcome, everybody. This is the League of Women Voters and Citizens for a Better Cities first forum in our series, Affordable Housing in Falls Church, Problems and Prospects. I'm Allison Brown, President of League of Women Voters Falls Church, and joining me in these opening remarks will be Hal Lippman, President of CBC. In this initial forum, we're going to be focusing on the past, specifically the decades between 1980 and 2020. We do so because examining past efforts to bring affordable housing to Falls Church is a key part of being able to understand what's happening in the present. That'll be the subject of our next forum. And subsequently, it'll set the stage for the third forum on the future of such housing in our community. For today's forum, we'll start in the early 1980s with the establishment of the nonprofit, city-sponsored Falls Church Housing Corporation. Since then, there have been a number of proposed or completed affordable housing projects, but only two of them, Winter Hill in the 80s and the Reed Building more than 20 years later, involved meaningful numbers of units. For Winter Hill, there were about 83 units, and in the case of the Reed Building, 9 of the 26 units were classified as teacher workforce housing. Otherwise, the only facet of affordable housing efforts where we've achieved some success is in a limited number of affordable dwelling units, referred to as ADUs, in 6 standalone apartment buildings and 1 townhouse community. As of 2019, according to the city's Status of Affordable Housing Update Report, the total number of ADUs amounted to just 71 units. And the ADU status of 12 of these units is subject to expiration this year and in 2023. And dozens more are likewise scheduled to expire between 2024 and 2035, which will be a huge loss. Now I'm going to turn it over to Hal Lippman, President of Citizens for a Better City.
Thanks, Allison. At the same time, over the decades, no less than 4 major proposed projects: a senior apartment building, a building on a downtown city-owned parking lot, a building at the site of a neighborhood public park, and a church-sponsored apartment building that included units for individuals with intellectual disabilities, all fell by the wayside. If constructed, these buildings collectively would have added hundreds of units to the city's affordable housing inventory. Summarizing the points above, a review of the 40-year record of affordable housing activity in our city reveals a pattern of well-conceived, persistent efforts, the results of which, however, have been limited at best. The discussion that follows aims to shed light on this checkered history and, as indicated earlier, set the stage for our upcoming forums. Lastly, before we move on, we would be very remiss if we didn't briefly mention several extraordinary recent developments that bode well for affordable housing activities in our city. Specifically, 2 new buildings, one in the late stages of construction and the other awaiting final official approvals, will add more than 60 ADUs to the inventory. And on top of that, just a few days ago, local officials learned that the city has been awarded a $3.75 million grant, which will enable it to significantly expand affordable home ownership opportunities and help preserve 9 existing ADUs whose subsidized rental status will otherwise expire. Although not the focus of today's agenda, these important developments will certainly be a key part of the discussion in our next forum at the end of April. And now it's my pleasure to turn things over to our esteemed moderator, Nancy Vincent, Director of the city's Department of Housing and Human Services. Nancy?
Esteemed, huh? Hal, if you're going to say nice things about me, make sure that my boss and my husband are listening. So, you know, I am thrilled that the League of Women Voters and Citizens for a Better City are putting on this series of forums. Affordable housing is so key to the long-term vitality of a community. And this multi-decade vantage point will truly set the stage for understanding its importance and learning how real inroads can be made in the future. So our panel today of experts know a little something about the history of affordable housing in Falls Church. So I'm going to let them briefly introduce themselves to you, and then we'll dive in. So first to speak about the 1980s will be Brian O'Connor. Brian, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and thanks to the League and to CBC for this forum on this great topic. I was on the City Council, ending a term as mayor in 1992, and I was on the Planning Commission from about 8 years, 1978 to 1986, and ended my terms as a couple terms as chairman. During that time, I was also in private practice as an attorney and participated as a volunteer attorney with the Falls Church Housing Corporation and others in the city to promote and acquire what we would say was affordable housing. Now, remember that in 1970s into the 80s, we had tremendous surge of condominium conversions in Northern Virginia and throughout the country, thousands and thousands of units. So the number of rental units was being reduced by these conversions. This occurred in what was Tyler Gardens, now known as Winter Hill, Cherry Hill. And the Falls Church Housing Corporation impetus for coming into existence, I believe, was because of these conversions. And there was some success here because the developer, Wills and Plank, were persuaded as they tore down units to allow the corporation to have access with certain conditions, of course, and these 83 units were preserved. This was a success. The corporation, boistered by this, wanted to acquire what was Westbrook Gardens, which is now known as the Fields. This is some 96 unit outfit, and I was very active in this. Simply put, I had banking connections through my law firm, and we obtained a loan commitment from Shenandoah Federal Savings and Loan for the acquisition of the property. Now, this was a syndicated project using tax credits, including for the owner, who was a local Fairfax County attorney, and I knew him. What occurred was we got the loan commitment, we were working on the syndication, and the owner, who had never been involved in such a thing before, was concerned about how these tax credits would work for his benefit. In the meantime, he got an offer of all cash for the property from a third party, and the rug was pulled out from under us. And the sad aspect of this failure was that these units would have been put into permanent service for our goals of more affordable housing in Falls Church, as opposed to a situation where the units could evaporate later because they would have been under the control of the housing corporation. And I would say that this is a goal that we ought to pursue in affordable housing. That is, to get some permanent housing. An example, when I was on the Planning Commission, we were able to persuade the developer of Reese Place to set aside a certain number of units that would be, quote, more affordable. They would be smaller. They would look like the other units. We were hoping to be able to leverage that, but the restrictions on those units evaporated over time, and they're just part of the market. They might cost less than luxury ones, but they are not truly part of our affordable housing stock. But I would like to mention that the flexibility of the zoning ordinance had changed at that time so that the city was able to do proffered zoning, which meant that you could have a negotiation with the developer and put conditions on the zoning approval. This flexibility did not exist in the past, and it still exists in the code and might be useful in the future with developers. I also want to say that this experience points out the necessity for involvement of the government, particularly local government, if you're going to have affordable housing as a feature of your community. And that's an important goal and a valuable goal. You will no more have affordable housing without government involvement if you rely on the market than Texas has with its unregulated electrical grid. I'm happy to discuss any of these things in more detail or answer questions. I will also mention Sunrise Senior during my tenure. The city owned the dirt, so it was able to do some leveraging to get some set-asides for the city residents for that unit, but it is not truly affordable housing. And I think that the city could have done more in the past to make this a more important goal for the city, recognizing that the Northern Virginia market is a difficult one for people, even our own teachers and policemen and city workers, to acquire housing within the city. I hope that I've covered this in a few minutes well enough. We should also recognize that the climate in Washington is important for these things. HUD was created in 1965. But the 68 Housing Act and the 68 Urban Development Act passed by Johnson then fell into Nixon's hands, then Ford, then Carter came along, then Reagan, and there was a turnover, if you will, to the market itself with the use of mortgage-backed securities and so on, which we all know about, and housing as a big catastrophe. So these grants and awards to the city, I think, are the way for us to proceed, although tax credits may be important in the future with developers and owners. Thank you.
Thank you. So next to cover the 90s will be Alan Bragman. And I do want to remind people, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. And at the end, we'll have a chance to answer your questions. So Alan, take it away.
Thank you. Excuse me. It's good to be in front of everybody. I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces as I flip through the screens. I've been a resident here in Falls Church since 1988. We came here primarily because of the school system. I think a lot of people are familiar with that story in terms of why they wanted to locate in this community. All three of my kids went through the Falls Church school systems, all graduated, all are doing well. So knock on wood, that's a good thing. As I mentioned, back in 1988, we've got 6 additions on this house. So I really don't want to move. I like this community. We like being here. This is where I will retire. I became active in the community back in the late 80s, early 90s. I started with coaching soccer, basketball, and t-ball for all of my children. I then was inaugural chairman for the Youth Commission in the early 90s, and then moved on to the Planning Commission, 93, 94, City Council, 94, 98, and the mayor from 96 to 98. Got 2 examples of affordable housing initiatives that I was involved with. One I would say was fairly successful if you compare it to the one that was not successful. And the fairly successful one was Whittier Place, also known as Whittier Circle, also known as Whittier Park. It was 76 units of 76 units of housing, single family, standalone, and townhouses. Of that 76, 6 of them were affordable units. We felt at the time that that was probably an okay number. If I could go back in time, I really would have liked to have had 20% of that development being affordable rather than just almost 10%. And the bad news is we lost one of the units because shortly after it was completed in 99 or 98, 99, it burned to the ground and was never replaced. So again, if I could go back in time, we probably should have rebuilt that rather than not. The interesting thing about this project, though, is that we almost immediately ran into opposition from many in the community because Whittier had been a parkland-like area for a number of years. So folks were, oh, what are we going to do? Oh, no, open space. Oh, no, we don't need more density. In reality, At that point in time, the city owned the land. We did want to try and figure out how we could monetize that asset. 1/3 of the site went to the Marriott extended stay housing, and the 2/3 went to the units that I was speaking about. The one good thing I believe that came out of this is we were able to leverage our ownership position into what I would call nowadays they call them P3s, public-private partnerships, because the city was able to share in the upside value of the units that the developer was going to build. One of the claims from many in the community is that we were selling the land cheap. So one way to save against underselling or under market was to make sure that we shared in any upside. And I think back then the units were selling in about 350 to 380 in that range for the townhouses. If you look at what they're worth now, they're up around 7 to 8. So everything that is the difference between what they were selling for to what the appraised value is now, the city effectively gets a check for that, which could then go back into the housing fund. Now, I haven't gone back to check to see if that's actually happening, but that's what was supposed to happen with that. The other project, which was not as successful, was actually an initiative of the Housing Corporation. I think they had brought the idea to the council to use the West End Park, which was also land that the city owned for senior housing. And the rub with that particular project at that point in time is that a portion of the land was owned by the volunteer fire department, Falls Church Volunteer Fire Department. So at the same time we were trying to negotiate to put a housing facility there, we were also negotiating with the fire department to try and figure out how we could effectively exchange the land for the new firehouse that eventually got built down on Lee Highway. Fly in the ointment is that the volunteer firemen wanted a community room on the second floor, and that was screwing with the value that we were trying to get. So we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to do that deal. In the meantime, the community again got together because West End Park was open land. It was park land for the most part. And NIMBY became an issue then. That was a big issue just starting back then, not in my backyard. Lots of folks were coming out and screaming that, oh no, we can't build there. We don't want that density. We want the open space. As an aside, I would suggest it's actually Brian had mentioned at one point in the conversation, we were talking about small houses and how the streets have changed. If you look at Grove Avenue now, it looks very different than what it looked back then. There's a lot of not quite McMansions, but very big houses. So I would argue that density actually took over that street versus what we might have been able to do with that parkland. But I just wish if we had had the impetus to be able to get that through before I got off of council, that would have been another project that we would have had at least for seniors to be able to transition into and not have to leave the community, which is one of the issues that we always had concern about. Brian mentioned one of the things that we looked at as a council as well, and I would say there were a couple of tools missing from our toolbox. One was it was not a housing policy in Falls Church. That did not get passed until 2013. If we had had that back when we were negotiating those deals, I think we might have been in a better position. Two, we went around and around and around as to what the definition of affordable housing is and was at that point in time, because we started off with the government definition, which was 30% of median income, affordable for housing. Then you hit the next level, and then you hit the next level, and ultimately up to what we ended up calling workforce housing, which is keeping our teachers here in homes that they could live in, keeping our city workers here in homes that they could live in. And that was where we ultimately ended up in terms of saying that's the kind of housing that we wanted to have. I think if we had a much more diverse definition of housing at that point in time, and we had put those restrictions on those developments, and we maybe would have had a little bit more diverse housing population than what we've got now. But that's, as Hal has said, we can talk about how that happens in the future. But that is a concern, I think, that as a community that we need to have, because we got to make sure that we're trying to take care of everybody when it comes to housing in our community, so that we can be as like the rest of the country as possible. On the Westbrook site, I'm pretty much the same place where Brian is on that. I really wish that the city had been able to grab control of that, because the one thing that I think that we need to look at as we go forward is making sure that whatever restrictions we put in place on these developments, that we put them in place for perpetuity. And now the developers will scream and say, we don't want to have that, but I spent 10 years doing development. And I know that when you look at the appreciation of properties in this area, we got to figure out how to tap into that so that we can make sure that we're supporting the type of housing that we want to see long-term. And I'll sit back and listen, and then certainly happy to answer any questions that anybody may have. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Alan. So next, to continue with the 90s through 2010, we have Katie Emmons.
Well, I see two experts here, Carol DeLong and Steve Rogers, so I expect them to wave their arms. In 2011, my entire basement went under 4 feet of water, so all my records from the Housing Corporation met their maker at that time. But I have a lot to say about the Housing Corporation. First of all, the Housing Corporation owned the property at Winter Hill because in Virginia, the city of Falls Church cannot own the property. And we considered ourselves part of the city government. We were an all volunteer board, and the executive director was paid by the city and managed the apartments. And so we saw ourselves as essentially an arm of the city of Falls Church advocating for affordable housing. I worked on more comprehensive plans. I'm confident Carol has too, than anybody can shake a stick at. And it's really led to no change whatsoever. So what was the job of the Housing Corporation? Our first job was to take care of Winter Hill and preserve it and make sure it was a very good example of low-income housing. It was a Section 8 property. And we added, Carol, chime in if this isn't right, ADA features to a couple of the apartments, which seniors usually don't have lots of stairs, but that development is full of stairs. Updated the windows and doors, again with grants, added 2 new apartments in the basement, two bedroom apartments in the basement of one building. And in the basement of another building, we added it was gathering room and the offices for the Housing Corporation and the management staff. Again, all with grants. Let's see. We also saw our job as an important part to promote community in the Winter Hill area. That is to say, lunches, speakers, free food for people, things like that. People, so that everybody, their neighbors knew each other and worked with each other. So it was a real community. Another function of the Housing Corporation is to preserve and add affordable housing. We took that very seriously. We bought a couple of those fourplexes not too far from the bowling alley, thinking that would be helpful. We kept involved with the residents and the board at Merrill House because they're vulnerable. We kept in touch with the owners of the Broad Falls apartments. Everybody's aware of that on 809 Broad Street. We looked at the property on Railroad Avenue. Bob Young knows that property well to see if we could make the numbers work. It didn't. We looked at the office building at 200 Park Avenue across from current Northside Social. It's a very idiosyncratic building. We thought, let's see if there's a way to make that mixed use for redeveloped. We couldn't make the numbers work. We looked, then we said, okay, this isn't working. Let's take a look at the city land, right? So that's where we looked at the parking in the Roberts building, which has a restrictive covenant. It has to be used for parking in the city of Falls Church or it reverts back to the family. Okay, we came up with a plan for a parking structure with senior housing on top. We thought it was inspired, right? Perfect, right across from Kaiser, walkable, great. The business owners along Lee Highway thought it might be inconvenient. Okay, that's out the window. Okay, then we went to West End Park. Alan has so nicely summarized that. All of a sudden, everybody who never went into that park thought it was a key ingredient to the city of Falls Church. Everybody is very much in favor of affordable housing, but not in anywhere near me. Okay. And remember, each of these projects requires a lot of money to get plans, to get architects, I remember there was the balloon imaging above West, I mean, really, huge amounts of nonprofit dollars went for this project, where people would come up to me on the street and say, I'm really in favor of affordable housing, but this isn't the right place. Okay, I took a deep breath. We all took a breath. Remember that, Carol? Remember that, Steve? Yeah, we took a deep breath. We thought, okay. We continued to advocate for ADUs. Don't you remember those anonymous sheets floating around Falls Church saying, poor people equals theft? Protect your daughters. Oh, come on. Okay, we took a deep breath. We thought, this isn't going anywhere we want to go. My gosh. In the mid-2000s, we took a different approach. Oh my God, this incredible guy named Bob Wilden came on, he was on the board. He was a retired HUD muckety muck. He said, what would you do with some big money? We said, we don't have that problem. And he said, now you do. I'm giving you $500,000 and I want you to think big. Okay, we said, we will think big. We will. So we heard about the city center. We went out and bought an office building in the center of everything. We thought, now we're a player. People said, we don't want anything with children. God knows we can't put more kids in the school system. So we said, this is going to be a senior project. Very unlikely that people in their 60s will have children, right? We came, I tell you, Carol Jackson was masterful. The financing she put together, the creative energy, it was a transportation hub. There were going to be medical offices. We were hot, right? Oh my gosh. Now I'm sure
Right,
Bob
Catherine,
Young
just
will
to
talk
say-
about this.
Sorry, just to say one more minute. I didn't want.
Okay, one more minute. Okay. Well, you know exactly what happened. I'm all in favor of affordable housing, but not here. And it's, by this time it was too much money and it went nowhere. So we threw in the towel and said, we're not building in the city anymore. There's no point. The end. I quit. Am I wrong, Carol? And on to the next person.
Well, thank you, Katie. So now we have Bob Young. That's going to be hard to follow. And Bob will cover 2005 to 2019. So Bob, would you start out introducing yourself and take it away?
I'm trying here. Okay. I'm Bob Young. I'm a commercial real estate developer in the city of Falls Church for the past 20 years. I been active in affordable housing for most of those years, particularly between 2003 and 2013, when pretty much all the projects I'm going to enumerate now very quickly were discussed, and I was involved in many of them. For example, on the Wilden project, I was going to do the medical office building. During that time, I worked most closely with Steve Rogers, Carol Jackson, and my architect, Jack Wilburn, who did a lot of the plans for these projects. As Katie's just mentioned, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars were spent on these projects, obviously to no avail. I should also mention that much of that money came from local churches who wanted to be involved and wanted to help. As has been said, that money went down the drain. So I can mention 5 or 6 projects. I won't go into any of them in great detail. One that hasn't been mentioned was the Ackridge project back in the early 2000s up on North Washington. I don't know how many affordable units were involved in that project, but it was approved, but never got off the ground because council insisted that 150,000 square foot office building be built before any of the residential. So Ackridge ended up by selling that land to Innova Fairfax. The Robertson parking lot was mentioned. and has been described. So I'll just mention that as another one that didn't work. Then we get to the West End Park, which again, I was involved in. Huge amounts of money were spent. And as has been mentioned, once more, we had really, really strong NIMBY reaction. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. I was involved in a project with Christ Crossman Church. Don't remember the exact years, but there were to be 13 units for special needs folks and a bunch of commercial. That one came all the way down to the end. And in the end, the congregants at Christ Crossman decided that they really didn't want to sell after all. So, you know, another 100 or 200,000 went down the drain on that project. The Wilden project is, of course, the unhappiest of them all. Katie's just described it in detail, so I won't. But I'll just note that our congressman at the time got $4 million for that project from the feds. Obviously, we never collected that money. My recollection is between that and the monies coming from VHDA, there was probably $10 million that could have gone into affordable housing in the city of Falls Church, didn't go in. So finally, I'll just mention the Reed Building, which is my project. As has been mentioned, 9 of the 26 units are supposed to be affordable at 80 to 100% of AMI. All of those units are rented at below 80% and have been pretty much for the last 14 or 15 years. Hopefully we'll be able to extend those units. There's a lot of work that needs to be done on how it's operated, but I would call it a qualified success. So how do I sum up here? I'd like to read a quote from yesterday's Washington Post. There was an article in the real estate section on affordable housing. It was pretty interesting, and I want to read a quote. They're talking here about the city of Ann Arbor, where I had the pleasure of living for a couple of years when I was in grad school. The city is progressive, at least in its language, and it has an outward persona as a place that is welcoming and wants decent, affordable housing for all people. Where the fight comes in are on the specific sites. Translated, of course, that means NIMBYism. Not to end on a down note, I want to say that the history that you've all just heard, and I'm the last speaker, is, in a word, dismal. But guess what? Probably in the last 90 days, more has been accomplished in the area of affordable housing in the city of Falls Church than has been accomplished in the last 30 years. With Letty Hardy's leadership and almost all the rest of the council being strongly in favor, I have really, really high hopes, you know, with the new Amazon grant and the new standard of 10%. In the Reed Building, we did 34%. And the hope there was that we would set a new standard that council could use as a precedent. Instead, they went on to adopt a 6% guideline. So I think we're headed in the right direction. We have a tremendous trajectory now. I hope that everyone can get behind it. And as the NIMBYism comes up, which it will, we can collectively beat it down and actually make some progress. From an economic development point of view, I chair the Economic Development Authority. We've tried to take some leadership under the argument that affordable housing is critical for economic development in the city. And we will continue to push to the extent that we can in this particular area. So thank you very much. Happy to answer questions.
Wow, what a fascinating, sad, and hopeful history of affordable housing in Falls Church. I have a few questions to ask of our panel, and as those of you who are listening, as you think of questions, please continue to put them in the chat, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. So the first question I want to ask is just to get your view on exactly what it is we're talking about. Why is affordable housing important, and who is it that we're trying to serve? And Bob, let me start with you.
Okay, put me on the spot. Go ahead. My answer to that is, as I just said, I think that affordable housing is critically important for economic development. I think it's even more important in terms of equity in our society, in our city. We all know that we have a city that is pretty white and pretty rich. And personally, I think it's important that we participate. Who's the target? Clearly, the target is to try to have a wider spread in the community of colors and religions and every other kind. But my personal view is that we have to find a way to target the Black community that largely doesn't exist in the city. I know that that's difficult. I think there are ways to do it, but given the horrendous history that the City of Falls Church has with respect to that community, I think that's where we ought to be going. I can't tell you I know how to get there, but I'm willing to help try. Thank you.
Okay. Brian, do you have anything to add?
The emphasis for Tyler Gardens wasn't a cultural thing. It was because there were elderly in there. That was a primary motive, I believe, at that time. But you did have families in there, and they could not afford to stay in the city. And that was something we didn't want to see. So that was a success. We were desperate to keep Westbrook Gardens, and fortunately the Fields has restrictions, and so it does meet the definition, I guess, of the code of affordable housing, but it's not permanent. It will cease to be under those restrictive covenants. And I agree with Mr. Young's comments. This is a real valuable thing for the community and to have equity in our society. But the race is almost incidental. That's because of the legacy we have. The housing benefits enacted in the Great Depression, when people moved from the cities to chase jobs into the suburbs, Blacks were not able to get the loans for housing, despite the New Deal. And that legacy continued to the present time. And in Detroit, when they turned over the 68 Housing Act and Urban Development Act to industry and Wall Street, they literally broke those neighborhoods with their approach, and it caused all kinds of social disruption. I want to add too, when you talk about the Black community and housing, it's needs to be there needs to be help for those people and many people, regardless of race, who've not owned homes before when they come into any kind of ownership, like Homestretch has been doing, because they need help to understand the ownership duties involved. And this is what happened in Detroit, and you see whole streets bulldozed now because of the failures of government to set these things as a value in those communities. And we can do better here in Falls Church.
Thank you. And Alan, do you have anything to say about why affordable housing is important and who it is that we're trying to serve?
Oops, sorry, had to get off mute. Yes, So as a result of being on the panel today, I went back and looked at a number of the housing policies and initiatives that we've got here in the city. And as I mentioned earlier, we didn't set our policy until 2013. And they're stipulated within that policy. And also there's a fact sheet, which also lists essentially what our policies are for diversifying our housing. There are 3 categories of qualifications that one must meet in order to get affordable housing in Falls Church. I would encourage you, all of you, to take a look at what those categories are, because the way that they're defined right now, and we've tried to get senior housing in here because senior housing is at the top of the list in terms of what we're trying to do. But each of those breaks down, each of the 3 categories. And by the way, there's a typo because it says there's 4, but it's actually only 3. But each of those categories lays out how you can qualify to get housing here. 1, you either have to be, senior, or you have to have special needs. You have to live in the city, or you have to have senior special needs and work for the city and live in the city, or just work for the city. And then as you go down to the different categories, it's broken out the same way. Ideally, if you're trying to attract the population that doesn't live in the city, our guidelines really don't allow for that right now. So if you want to improve the way that you're attracting individual families to come to the city, you have to make sure that your guidelines allow for those families to move in. And that has to be changed in order to change the demographic of what the city looks like. The other thing is I mentioned earlier in my talk that, we really focused on workforce housing. I believe we focus on that to get away from the issues of going into what you might define as really affordable housing or moderate housing. Because again, it is a definition of who you might get or what they're going to look like. And if you don't say you're going to dive below those thresholds, then you're not going to get that. Although I would argue now we're moving more and more towards having, a more diverse community at the higher economic levels. But you guys see what goes on around this community. People are tearing down $600,000, $700,000, $800,000, $900,000 homes to put up homes that are 1.2, 1.4, $2 million homes. So that's the type of thing you've got to battle against in terms of trying to figure out how to get a more diverse economic community into this community. So we just change your guidelines. At least that's a start for trying to fix some of the things that have not been right in the past.
Okay, thank you. And Katie, why is affordable housing important?
Well, all of the above. And my experience is that my daughter pulled herself out of the school system and went over to a private school in Maryland. And she had more economic diversity and racial and national diversity in her class than they had across the grade level here. And it was a stunning wake-up call to me. So did it make a difference? It sure did. The discussions were different. The school was different. And in this community, you'll find the teachers have to drive so far that we didn't used to have snow days because our streets were clean, right? Forget it. If they're coming in from the outer suburbs, they can't get here. So it matters for moral reasons. It matters for economic reasons. It matters for the strength of our community and who we are.
Gotcha. Okay, so let me change gears a little bit since we've been talking about the history of affordable housing in Falls Church. So the question I have is, in your view, what are the 2 or 3 most important lessons learned in trying to increase the amount of affordable housing in Falls Church? And for this one, let's start with Alan.
Okay. I go back again, or I hearken back to the conversations that we had with the developer, which was a push and pull, to and fro. There's one benefit, I think, to being in a community like ours, where you've got an incentive for a developer to build because they know they're going to be able to make money. They're ultimately not going to lose money. So if that's the case, and I think Brian mentioned it, or maybe Bob mentioned it, we got a 6% set aside for affordable housing. Give me a break. It should be a lot more than that. The developers can afford it. And what I've learned is actually being on the other side of the equation where I was a developer for 10 years, they'll find ways to make it work. They will find ways to make their money. So I would argue that 1, 2, and 3 is hold their feet to the fire, make them commit to the community if they want to be here, and extract what we need to extract in order to get the units built that we want to have built. I wouldn't go easy on them. I would not go easy on them. Some of you have heard me talk a long time ago about the amount of commercial development that we got here. Build less housing, build more commercial development, and then you can actually use the commercial to subsidize the fact that we don't have the amount of ADUs that we want. But I would not, I just don't like, I wouldn't play nice with the developers, okay? And speaking from inside, Bob will probably crucify me, but having been on that side of the table, I know what the equation is, I know how it works, I know what it looks like, and I think we can do a lot more to extract a lot more.
Nancy?
Yes, go ahead, Bob.
Thank you. Let me first address Alan's comments. I think you're correct, Alan, up to a point. My approach, as many of you on this call know, is the reality is for any significant development, such as the ones we've been seeing and approving, there in fact is a pot of money in the developer's pocket that he or she is prepared to spend on what we call voluntary concessions. It is up to the city. It's up to the city council and the citizens to decide how that money is to be spent. Historically, it's gone mostly to schools, a little to library and parks, and very little to, relatively speaking, to affordable housing. So that brings me to my main point, which is an answer to this question. Obviously, NIMBYism is a problem, and that comes back to the political will, ultimately, of the city council. Is there the political will to insist on affordable housing as opposed to other concessions? And finally, and in the end, we as a community have a budget every year. That budget reflects our commitments. Historically, the city has always committed to a fine school system and has obviously succeeded greatly in that direction. On the other hand, we fail miserably when it comes to affordable housing. So when it comes down to it, the question is the city willing to spend money on affordable housing or not? Thanks.
Thanks, Bob. So Katie, what do you see are the 2 or 3 lessons learned?
Well, advocacy is absolutely crucial, education and advocacy. One, no in any kind of affordable housing development. For example, Brian, for that group to go in and grab that property when you were putting together, and the guy said, well, sure, why not? If, you know what, if the community had said, hold it, or if there'd been a group, a big outcry over that, it could have changed the tide. Our experience on the Housing Corporation is that 1 no was worth 100 yeses, no matter what those yeses were. And if that's true, nothing ever gets off the ground, no matter how much money is spent.
Thank you. And Brian.
I will only comment that it wasn't the city policy. It was a few people's policy to get affordable housing at that time. It wasn't, for example, when I was on the commission and the council, we were talking about legislation. We spent hours and hours on historical preservation. We spent a lot of time on streetscape issues. We were not spending time on affordable housing issues that we needed to spend. And I was persuasive in some cases, but not in others. And the NIMBY is very real, and you have to have the political will to deal with it. As Roger Wallenberg once said, in a different context, we elect people to do good, not to get reelected. So sometimes you have to stick your neck out a little bit. And you know what? It can be worth it.
Okay, thank you. So the next question I have, is, has the legacy of discrimination in Virginia affected efforts to build affordable housing in Falls Church? And if so, how? So for this one, let's start with Katie.
Well, I was looking at the property deeds for our area from just my little development. I live up the street from TJ. And I discovered this was a whites only development. And you know what? It still is only a whites. I mean, please. So is the past still present? Oh my word, yes. Yes. Now, was there another part to that question?
If it's the case, so how? But it seemed like you answered the question, so if
Right?
you're good, I'll move on. Let's, Alan, do you have anything to add to that?
I actually, I'm with Katie. It's when I bought my house here in 1980, it was 87, 88, and got a chance to look at the deed. There were covenants in that deed, which were restrictive with respect to blacks owning in Falls Church in Fairfax County. Is it still the case today? I think not. However, there may be situations where certain people will not sell to other people, or, you know, I mean, I can remember 10 years ago, for instance, it was real. 10 years ago, I would send my wife in sometimes to have a conversation rather than me going in, depending on what neighborhood we were in. Not necessarily here in Falls Church, but certainly in Northern Virginia. And it would make a difference the way that, you know, it was perceived as to whether or not she was buying or they didn't know that I was, you know, hooked with her at the hip. There are, you know, there are issues related to our boundary lines, which I could certainly talk about. You talk about Tenor Hill. When I was on the council, we had a dust up with Fairfax County because Fairfax County was trying to move the boundary lines to reincorporate portions of Tenor Hill into Fairfax County, which would have taken away from the population count of blacks in the city. And I sat down with him. I said, absolutely not. You know, we're not going to do that. So there, you know, and that was, as I said, that was 98, 96 to 98 when I was on the council end. So there's, you know, my hope is that it has changed. Perhaps it's not overt as it may have been before, but, you know, we've, if you change those guidelines, let's see what happens. Let's see how the community reacts.
Okay, thank you. And Brian, has the legacy of discrimination in Virginia affected efforts to build affordable housing in Falls Church?
It's hard for me to say that that has been avert as far as the council or planning commission has been concerned, but it's a real factor in the society, and it should be faced straight on. But I would think those issues can be dealt with in Falls Church. But to recognize that cultural diversity and racial diversity and economic diversity are important to this community and to its health and well-being for all of us, I think is important.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Bob, do you have anything to add?
No, I think maybe we ought to get on to questions from the many people that are on this call. As far as I can tell, you know, there's 75 or 100 folks. There must be some questions, so let's hear them.
This
And
is Allison Brown, and I'll be relaying the questions from chat. So let me first ask to Alan, who's been speaking about the city's guidelines. Is that city council who would be responsible for changing the guidelines or another entity?
I think city council ultimately will pass the ordinance that would change the guidelines, but you're going to be working with the housing corporation, the housing commission, whatever bodies we've got in place to look at those types of issues. I think the original drafting and so we were all off of the council. I'm trying to think who was on. Well, David's still there, certainly. He was there in 13, I believe. You know, just look at how that came about, how that document came about. And then we'll know what needs to be done in order to change it. But the council ultimately will change or will vote on what the guidelines should be.
Okay, and a few of these ask for very specific facts, so I'll relay them. And then if you don't have the facts, we'll have another forum coming up in April, and we will make sure to prepare and present the information then. But somebody asked, so when we do have affordable units that are open, what is the ratio of applicants as compared to the number of people who, who are able to obtain the units? Sort of, or if you have just a sense of the demand, that's, I think, what the question is getting at.
So I could probably answer that one. As affordable dwelling units come on, there is a wait list. And so people get on the wait list based on the priorities that Alan talked about. And that should absolutely be looked at. So there are affordable rental units in the Northgate and Pearson Square apartments, and those are managed by city staff. And so the wait list is maintained by them. There is not enough affordable housing. There are always more people on the wait list than can be served by these apartments. West Broad and Tinner Hill manage their own wait lists, and the same is true for those properties. That particularly the 2-bedroom apartments, their wait list is long for those. So the more affordable dwelling units we can get to meet the demand, and I mean that's really in housing, it's our biggest unmet demand is for this low income and moderate income and what we're being called workforce housing apartments.
Do Falls Church City employees tend to qualify for the workforce apartments? How do their incomes compare to the AMIs that you need for the affordable units?
We do have schools employees in affordable dwelling units. So for the most part, yes.
Okay. How does zoning and any potential zoning changes affect affordable housing? Will anybody speak to that?
If you want, I'll speak to that.
Go ahead, Bob.
Well, it's a hugely controversial topic during this time. Essentially, zoning since World War II has really caused what we now call the affordable housing shortage. That is particularly in the suburbs where most everything is zoned for single family homes. As you all have seen, or some of you at least, the notion that the city council would allow granny flats or whatever you want to call them seems to be a matter of controversy, much less if we did what Durham, North Carolina did recently, where they designated a significant area of the city and said that without public hearings, if you have a 50-foot lot, you can by right split it in half, and you can build a duplex on both of those properties. So you now have, instead of one small house, you have 4 units, and there's no requirement for any on-site parking. I would call that pretty dramatic. I had a helping hand in getting that crafted and eventually approved. I don't see that happening in the city of Falls Church, but I will tell you that zoning is the basis of everything when it comes to affordable housing, particularly if we want it to be anything remotely like widespread through the city. I recognize people are worried that their neighborhoods will be overrun with cars and who knows what else. But that's the answer to the question. Zoning is the key to everything, in my view.
Does anybody else have any content about zoning and how various zoning changes in Falls Church over the years have affected where housing is built?
Yeah, Allison, I'd like to comment on that. You have to remember that we are 2.2 square miles. And you have to remember that the bulk of our community is, as Bob was just saying, single family homes. There's a lot of properties already that have been subdivided, and rather than getting, 4 units in exchange for one, you're getting 2 homes in exchange for one. And that's happened all over the city. Is zoning restrictive in terms of affordable housing? I cannot imagine that any council would be able to survive. Any planning commission would be able to survive, because it's got to come from the planning commission ultimately up to the council, would be able to survive suggesting that we rezone single family properties for multifamily properties. I just don't see that would happen. Or arguably in our community, that commercial would get changed to to residential, although rental properties tend to get qualified as commercial, which is always interesting, which gets into that whole issue about the school. And I can remember running equations on how many kids were going to be in apartments, 0.35 kids. In reality, because the schools were so damn good, you ended up with much more than that in the apartments. So yes, zoning is a part of it, but it's not the only part. And I think you really have to then take a more holistic look at the community in terms of what we actually can afford to do, where we can afford to do that, and arguably which projects we may be able to ask to be able to contribute to the addition of affordable, housing units within our community. But it's tough when you're looking at the residential split between what we've got versus the amount of land we have left to play with. I'm going to go off on a tangent for one small second, because I thought that a major opportunity that we lost, even though we've got a great high school now, and I'll go all the way back to the Northern Virginia Graduate Center when that was done, because I argued that it should have been done differently than the way we did it. But the fact that Falls Church West Metro is going to redevelop their property right next to our property being redeveloped, to me means that, again, this is putting my developer hat on for a moment, we could have partnered with WMATA and Northern Virginia Community Center to have a much larger site up there that maybe do a lot more than what's just being proposed on our piece of it. Now, some of that is also Fairfax County, because I think we got, quite frankly, taken to the woodshed on where the boundary lines are up there. But I think we just have to be much more creative about how we get things done in this community, because we are so small land-wise. Okay, we are so small land-wise. So I think we've got to be really smart about how we end up redeveloping or improving the assets that we've got.
Does any other have any final comments on zoning issues and how they impact? Okay. There was a question if affordable housing units have an effect on property values in a neighborhood. Is anybody familiar with any of those studies?
And Allison, you were cutting out a little bit. Could you repeat the question?
Sure. Is anybody familiar with any studies that get to the impact of affordable housing on property values? I think the question was getting at if residents are concerned that building affordable housing would impact their property values. Are there any academic studies on whether that's the case?
I think we can certainly find studies. We can certainly find economic impact studies for how housing impacts land values, property values within a community. But just remember the numbers that I talked about relative to Whittier, and the majority of Whittier is not affordable housing, but I would be willing to bet you that those units that are affordable housing on Whittier Place and Whittier Circle are not bringing down the property value of those homes. It's just, I can't imagine that would happen. And if you look at the value of what's happened with the condominiums, for instance, even in the Winter Hill area, those are turning over at amazing prices. So I think the argument that used to be made for why you don't want to have, denser housing or affordable housing in neighborhoods because it brings value down, I don't believe that argument holds water anymore. But I think we can certainly find.
Right.
I think we
Yeah,
can certainly find some studies to support that.
Allison, it's Bob Young.
sure. Mhm.
I don't know if Nancy Vincent has any of that data in her head. I'm quite certain, I can't produce studies that it's provably the case that affordable housing, whether it be in apartment buildings or single family houses or whatever, has no impact whatever in any negative way on housing, housing values. I hate to do this, but Letty, can I put you on the spot and ask if you might be able to comment on that? You're always deep in the data. Sorry.
Bob, could you repeat what you wanted me to chime in on?
And actually, Letty, you already have in the chat. I think you were typing while he was talking. So a couple of our audience members have put links in the chat to studies on whether affordable housing has an impact on property values. And
Yes.
Letty pointed out in the chat that the Furman Center study is one of the best meta-analyses on this. So
Yes, I was typing that response. I didn't know you were going to call me Bob. If you click on that link, that is a good review of various studies to date. The quick answer is that there's very little evidence that it actually impacts property values adjoining. I think it's more fear mongering than not.
That's exactly right. And I saw that Josh Accor put a link in the chat as well.
So thank you so much, Councilmember Hardy. And I'll also point out that Councilmember Connolly put information in the chat about the school children and that the City of Falls Church does analyses every year. And it's not the case that the mixed use buildings are the primary driver of the growing student population. So, Councilwoman Connolly, and I know that Councilmember Hardy also has put many, charts and analyses together to show that school children are coming from all kinds of properties around the city. So.
If I could speak for a minute, I'm Kathy Nelson. I lived in Montgomery County from 1979 until 2016 and was on the board there of the Bethesda Interfaith Housing Coalition. And we bought MPDUs and rented them and so forth. And there were, I'm not sure whether it would count as an academic study, but there was no evidence at all that having our MPDUs rented to Section 8 tenants had any negative effect on property values. Instead, property values went up so much that it was hard for us to keep on. I went off the board in 1984, so I don't know since then, but I'd say, if anything, the impact was that property values went up because there was some small extent of diversity in both economics and race and culture. And I'm I love Falls Church, but I must say my husband and I bought our house in the Rosemary Hills neighborhood in Silver Spring because we wanted to live in an area where the very diverse neighborhood had fought to keep the very diverse elementary school open. We wish there were more places like that in the country. If my husband hadn't died, I'd still be there now. But I like Falls Church.
Turn it over to the panelists. Let us know. Okay, well, I want to thank everybody for participating, putting together great questions. We hope you'll join. Yep, and I'm going to turn it over to Hal to close us out.
Yeah, we're joined at the hip, Allison and I, at this point, which is a wonderful thing to say. I just want to do there's some substance to what I'm going to say in concluding and some procedure. The thanks to everybody, to the panelists, to Brian, to Katie, to Alan, and to Bob, and our wonderful moderator, Nancy Bissett, and everyone else who's helped put this forum together today. We really hoped at the outset, and I feel that I'm confident that I think we did provide some helpful shedding of light on where we've come from and how we got where we are with affordable housing. There is a 40-year record, and there is a lot of legacy that has gone on. I will single out the news press if anybody wants to read accounts of what's happened going back to 2008. It's all there in the archives, and the details of what happened that some of the panelists went over are there for people to retrieve. We look forward to seeing everybody at the next forum at the end of April is what we're projecting, which will focus on the status of the present efforts we alluded to in our opening statement. I will emphasize that the recording of this session will be on the League of Women Voters website and the Citizens for Better City websites. And I suppose it'll probably get other places, but for sure, that's where a recording of this session can be found. My last 2 cents is to salute what was referred to as the grandma of affordable housing in Falls Church, Carol DeLong, who's on this call. Many times when I was talking to people, that was the first thing to say, oh, she goes back to the very beginning. So Carol, a salute to you. And that is, for me, a very good way to end this session. Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of the afternoon.
Thank you very much. Good job, everybody.
Take care, everybody. See you in 2 months.
Let's do it again sooner.
Thank you all.